be here to start the meeting, so Vice Chair Cassie Wilkins will begin our budget meeting process.
I'd like to call, am I on? Yeah. I'd like to call the meeting to order. I'd like to announce our newest member, Miranda. Nice to have you. Thank you for being here. Are there any adjustments to the agenda? Item 1.2? None for me.
And one more quick reminder, folks, because we are on Zoom and people won't know necessarily who's talking, please introduce yourself if you are making comments or are asking questions. It's helpful for the audience we have at home.
Awesome, thank you. We'll move on to 2.0 action items. Election of Budget Committee Presiding Officer. Are there any nominations?
Cliff, this is when you nominate who's going to be our presiding officer.
Are there any nominations?
Is this a nomination for the presiding officer?
Yes, it is.
With a great deal of pleasure, I would like to get him back in the fold. John Higgins would be the presiding officer this year. I nominate him.
No objections.
Do I hear a second? All right. Moving forward, despite John's face.
I know.
It's been moved and seconded.
It's been moved and seconded. Can, all in favor say yes?
Yes.
Yes.
All in favor say no?
Opposed.
Okay, it's passed. Hearing no objections. Oh, congratulations, John. You may have the gavel.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that nomination, Cliff, and appreciate the Budget Committee's confidence in designating me as a presiding officer. I have an agenda here that we will proceed with. I think we've already taken care of the call to order by the chair, and we've gone through 1.1, 1.2. We've elected the presiding officer 2.1. Now we need to adopt the rules to establish operating procedures for Budget Committee meetings. And the committee can choose to adopt Robert's Rules of Order or establish its own rules. Do I hear a motion in that regard?
I move to adopt Robert's Rules of Order.
Second?
I second.
Having a nomination, or a motion and a second, I'll now take a vote. All those in favor of adopting Robert Rules of Order to govern our Budget Committee meeting this evening, all respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? So passed. Now I'd like to have Cassie, if she would, to recite Robert's Rules of Order from memory for me.
Well, did we adopt the yeses and nos or the ayes and nays?
Very good. All levity aside, we move on to 3.0 communications, delivery of the budget message by Superintendent Cole.
Very good. Thank you all for being here tonight. Appreciate your service to the community and district. I'd like to welcome Budget Committee staff members and members of the public attending today's Budget Committee meeting. This is the first Budget Committee meeting to review the proposed 2022-2023 Grants Pass School District Number 7 budget. The proposed budget being presented to you this evening is based on the second half of biennial budget of $9.3 billion for education. This funding level that makes up the district's general fund was a 49%, 51% split over the course of the 2021-2023 biennium. This funding level does not include funding from House Bill 4030 for the recruitment and retention of staff. The funding from House Bill 4030 will, however, support some budgetary adjustments in the general fund. The Student Success Act, approximately $4.5 million, and the High School Success Act, also known as Measure 98 funds, approximately $1.5 million, are not part of the state school fund allocation and are provided to districts with specific requirements for their use. While we have been encouraged to see Oregon's economy bouncing back as we've navigated through the season of COVID-19 mandates that have significantly impacted our educational institutions, A final budget number will not be determined until the final legislative forecast expected in June of 2022. Unfortunately, the district has seen a significant drop in enrollment over the past 2 years, resulting in reduced funding that requires the district to make necessary adjustments to the general fund budget. The district is aggressively working to recoup enrollment that should result in increasing revenue over future years. It should be noted that this budget demonstrates continued use of one-time funds in general fund revenue resources resulting from the elementary and secondary schools emergency relief, also known as ESSER funding. These are one-time dollars that are intended in scope to support school districts due to the impact of COVID-19, including loss of enrollment. The 2022-2023 proposed budget will be allocating the remaining $16.6 million of these federal dollars. The district continues to face increasing costs as a result of collective bargaining obligations, essential staffing costs, as well as increasing costs for utilities, insurance, and other recurring expenditures. While the legislature has made some minor PERS reform that have resulted positively for the district in recent years, projections beyond this biennium continue to demonstrate a continued impact on the district's obligation for the unfunded PERS liability. The district is committed to aligning our resources to reflect the priorities of our strategic plan guided by the following pillars. We're striving to build a resilient community. We are grounding our practice in equity and inclusive practices. We are ensuring strong academic outcomes and post-secondary plans for all students. We are focusing our attention on safety, facilities, strong operations, and building organizational capacity. The proposed 2022-2023 budget presented to the Budget Committee for consideration this evening strives to strike a balance by allocating available resources to address rising staffing and other costs, continuing to expand our efforts to strategically address the needs of our students and families so they can take full advantage of the outstanding educational, extracurricular, and college and career readiness opportunities our district has to offer. Based on these priorities, the proposed 2022-2023 budget is intended to achieve the following specific objectives: preserve a full school year and maintain all current programs for our students. Provide adequate resources to meet the district's anticipated collective bargaining obligations, including associated FICA and PERS employer costs. Provide funding for estimated non-salary related costs increases, including utilities, insurance, technology, and professional services. Invest significant one-time funding into capital projects to improve quality, safety, and security of our facilities, to meet the district's elementary classroom construction and HVAC improvement debt obligations, and to address critical deferred maintenance and capital equipment needs. Maintain a yet still strong PERS reserve level of more than $3.366 million to help protect against forthcoming PERS employer rates. The following table summarizes the district's 2022-2023 general fund available resources. I won't read a chart to you. Director Ely will provide more detail regarding various revenue and expenditure variances during the formal budget presentation. The following tables summarizes the general fund resources and use, increases and decreases in the proposed budget in comparison to the last several budget years. There's a big table there on page 3. Other funds, significant points in the 2022-2023 proposed budget document for other district funds are as follows. Federal Programs Fund, anticipated based on initial estimates received from ODE that title funding may be decreasing in 2022-2023. Title 2A, professional development funding, is projected to be relatively flat, as is funding for IDEA, which is a federal support mechanism for students with special needs. For student body funds, the proposed budget provides sufficient appropriation for fundraising efforts in site-based 150 accounts and the 280 fund student body accounts. Food service fund. With the implementation of the Community Eligibility Program, known as the CEP, the district has seen an increase in participation. Due to the pandemic, the Food Services Fund ran a deficit of nearly $160,000 in 21-22. We do anticipate this fund will be self-sustaining in 22-23, excuse the typo, 21-22 and 22-23 as the district gets back to normal operations. Cool Schools Fund, this fund continues to receive deposits through a program developed by the Oregon Department of Energy. The revenue received through this program will help service the debt of the HVAC that was completed in fall of 2021. Plus replacement fund, this fund for the district, which allows the district to account for and reinvest the funds received from Oregon Department of Education for the depreciation of the district's bus fleet. Per state statute, all buses must be replaced with vehicles that meet the EPA's emission standards. The district has until 2025 to accomplish this, and we are well on track to meet the standard. High School Success Fund, Measure 98. These funds are used for dropout prevention, career and technical education, and college-level education opportunities. Student Investment Account. These funds are a result of the corporate activity tax. Allowable investments for these funds fall under these areas: expanding instructional time, addressing student health and safety, reduce class sizes and caseloads, and provide a well-rounded education. PERS Reserve Fund. At the end of the 21-22 school year, the PERS Reserve will have a balance of $3.66 million. The district currently has no plans to use any of these funds in the 2022-2023 school year. Capital Projects Fund, the proposed budget includes a $600,000 transfer from the general fund to the Capital Projects Fund in order to fund various capital improvements and deferred capital maintenance needs of the district. Director Ely will explain the projects that administration is proposing for the 2022-2023 school year. Insurance Reserve Fund. This fund is used to pay the claims submitted for those employees who participate in the district's health reimbursement account. This is a benefit the district provides for those employees who do not otherwise qualify for a flexible spending account or health savings account. In conclusion, in writing my sixth and final budget message as superintendent, I've reflected on the 21 years for which I've had the privilege to be a teacher, coach, and administrator in Grants Pass School District Number 7, as well as watch my own children have the opportunity to experience tremendous educational, co-curricular, and extracurricular opportunities. Over the recent years, we have celebrated numerous awards and achievements for individual students and school programs. Grants Pass School District Number 7 is an exceptional public education organization, and the financial forethought demonstrated by our school board, budget committees, and district leadership have allowed the district to continue to recruit and retain high-quality staff, maintain a full instructional year, and retain and expand educational and extracurricular programs for our students and families. In closing, I would like to thank the staff, particularly Chief Finance and Operations Officer Sherry Ely and her team, for their efforts in preparing the proposed 2022-2023 budget. In addition, I'd like to thank the board and budget committee members for their ongoing commitment to our students, our staff, and the programs that make our district successful. We have so much to be thankful for as we continue to foster hope, engagement, and resilience for our students, families, and for our community. Respectfully submitted, Kurt Cole.
Kurt, very much. Thank you for your time as superintendent as well.
Thank you.
All right, so 3.2 is explanation of the method for community to submit concerns. Been a while since I've been here, but I would imagine that the comments from patrons wishing to speak to specific agenda items or other parts of our meeting at 5.2 will cover part of that. Sherry, could you clarify any additional community input source?
Yes, if there is anybody on Zoom, they can submit their comments through the chat, and that will be monitored by district staff who will convey those comments to us.
Very good. So, having addressed the input for community comment, we'll move on to 4.0. I think maybe I'm a little too confident. Try that. 4.1, explanation review of the proposed 22-23 budget document, which you all should have at your desk there. And I think I turn it over to Chief Finance and Operations Officer Sherry Ely.
Thanks, John. As John mentioned, you guys do have a copy of the budget at the table. In section 1, we just have reference materials that list who the budget committee members are, who the board members are who are participating in the budget committee. And we have, I lost my train of thought there, sorry. Section 2, we have our district-wide summary reports, where that has funds 100 through 699, as well as some other information based on the entire budget. In section 3 is our Fund 100 and Fund 150. Fund 100 is our major general fund. That's where the majority of the district's finances flow through that fund. Fund 150 is a fundraising account that the schools have, similar to our Fund 280, which is a club accounting fund. The Fund 150 money comes to the schools by donations from community members and other methods. So the principals have more say in how the Fund 150 funds are spent. The Fund 280 funds, they have to have student input on those funds. So that's the difference between the 150 and the 280. We do have to combine the 100 and 150 funds for purposes of the budget document because they are under the umbrella of Fund 100. Section 4 contains all of our other funds. So those are funds 200 through Fund 699. So that's where you'll find our federal funds, the PERS reserve, the bus replacement fund, our cool schools fund, capital projects, and our debt service funds are found in section 4. And then in section 5 is the general fund detail. And as I go through the budget presentation, there are a couple of changes that I have made to the budget document that I'll explain as I go through. Do you guys have any questions about the format of the document or anything else related to the budget document? You want me to keep going?
Keep on going.
All right. So we're going to go through the formal budget presentation now. If you guys could hold your questions until the end, that would be great. And then if we have any questions that come in via Zoom, Todd, will you let me know what those are?
Yeah, the only person we have online is Carrie Bassett.
Okay.
That's it. The only question is whether she votes or not.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. And Carrie Bassett is one of our budget committee members who was not able to be here tonight, so she is participating remotely. So Todd, this is not advancing. Oh, there we go. All right, so you guys also have a copy of the slides at your desk if that's easier for you to look at. So the first slide that you see is just explaining what the pillars that the board has voted on and what their priorities and their goals are for the district. And so there are 4 priorities. Let me be sure if you don't mind. Thank you. So pillar 1 is we're striving to build a resilient community. Pillar 2 is we are grounding our practice in equity and inclusive practices. Pillar 3, we are ensuring strong academic outcomes and post-secondary plans for all students. And pillar 4, we're focusing attention on safety, facilities, strong operations, and building organizational capacity. And those are the pillars that district administration refers back to as we are looking at the best way that we feel that we should spend the district's resources. And then the next slide is just kind of a visual of how we go about building our budget. So district administration is constantly going through an ongoing needs assessment based on changes that we are seeing. As you guys know, during COVID, there were a lot of changes, so there was a lot of assessing that we were doing along the way. We're looking at our programs continuously. Are we getting the value for those programs? Are they serving the students and our family members the way we were hoping that they would? Any new mandates, those are always taken into consideration. Academic return on investment, that's part of that continuous program review. And then ultimately is how much cash do we have to spend? That kind of governs everything that we do. These are our sources of funding. Our major source of funding is the state school fund. We have a small amount of local revenue. We have our special revenue funds, which I mentioned earlier, capital projects, and our internal service fund. And we do have one new fund, the debt service fund. Oh, and yes, COVID relief funds, that's been a big deal. This slide just shows you how our account code structure works. So when you're looking at the budget document, the first three numbers that you'll see are the fund numbers. So like for fund, the general fund, it would be Fund 100. The second set of numbers are going to be the function numbers. That's going to be a 4-digit number. That's going to tell you what program that those funds are being budgeted for. So for an example, 1111 is elementary. The next set of numbers are object numbers, and that tells you what the thing is. And so, like if it's a 460 objects, that is a non-consumable, something that costs more than $100 but less than $5,000. So something that potentially would be kept in the classroom for a while. The next set of numbers are the location. That's a 3-digit number. Each of our locations has 3 digits. And then the last set of numbers is area of responsibility. So if you want to break down what the expenditures are for, you can break it down to that 5-digit code. So for example, special education is 32000. So any of our general fund expenses that are for our special ed students would have that code of 32000. So when you look at the account code string, especially when you're looking at the detail, that's what the structure is of each of those. So the next slide is portraying our weighted ADM. And as you guys can see, we did have a pretty significant decline in ADM through the period of COVID. Prior to that, our ADM was holding pretty strong, and then we did see a significant decline. And just so that you know what ADM weighted means, so we receive a specific amount of dollars per student, and then the weighted piece comes in for our pregnant and parenting teens. We receive an additional weighting. For our ELL students, we receive an additional 0.5 weighting, and for our special ed students, we receive one more additional weighting. And so that's what takes us from where you see our enrollment numbers to this weighted ADM number, are those special weightings. There are also weightings for poverty and our foster and neglected students as well. All of that factors into the ADM weighted number. The next slide is our student demographics. This has not changed much over the years. As you guys know, we're a predominantly white school district, and this graphic is just a representation of that. Our special needs population has stayed pretty consistent in the 780-ish range over about the last 3 years. We anticipate that'll be the same this next year, but we're hoping our enrollment will increase, and so that number might go up if we do see an increase in enrollment overall. Our English language learners, that number, we're seeing a little bit of an increase, and these are our students that come to us where English is not their first language, and so we have a special program that does serve those students, and so we have seen a little bit of an uptick in those students. And then our community eligibility program. This replaces the free and reduced program because Josephine County qualifies as a high poverty area. We qualify for 100% of our students receiving a free lunch and a free breakfast. We are in a grace period right now because our poverty numbers have dropped a little bit. That grace period lasts for 5 years, and so we'll have to continue to evaluate that to make sure that we can maintain our participation in this program. And then this was just a comment that we had from the school board. This was a message during COVID, particularly asking the community just to support the district. which we do appreciate their support for sure. The next slide, we're going to start getting into some numbers. This is our all funds revenue summary. And so this year, we're looking at a little over $130 million of revenue. And as you can see, the majority of that funding comes from the general fund. Special revenue is the next major source of funding for the district, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these funds in just a moment. This gives you a little bit of a breakdown, a little bit easier to read than the chart of the funds that we receive from each of the funding sources. So as you can see, the general fund is just short of 90 million. The Fund 150 is 2 million, and then special revenue 14.39. Student body is 2.5. Food service is 4.3. Our Cool Schools Fund, we've spent out the majority of that this year on the debt service for the HVAC program. And so the amount that we receive each year is around 130,000, and we have about 25,000 in carryover. So that fund is lower. Last year it was about 600,000. Our bus replacement fund is it's not really at almost 3 million, but we have to budget for any leases that we take out for the buses that we're purchasing. So we have to budget the revenue and the expense. And we are planning on buying some more buses this year. And so we will have another lease so that we can continue on our bus replacement program. Our PERS reserve is staying pretty static at 3.36-ish million. Debt service, we have several transfers going into that to help service the debt on the HVAC system. And I know we've talked about that at a couple of other meetings too. We'll go into that a little bit more. Capital project 6.78. I'll go through the list of projects that we have out there in just a bit. And then insurance reserve is our smallest fund at 57,000. Excuse me. Our district general fund resources. And so as you can see, the majority of our funding comes from the state school fund. We do have 16.6 million. That's our other major source of revenue for general fund, and that's ESSER funds that we'll be talking about how we're going to be using those funds in just a moment. Our beginning fund balance is at 4.5, and then our local revenue is at 3.4 million. And this is just a breakdown of how the state school fund is calculated. Turn the page because I can see this better curve. Thanks. So the state school fund proper is at 46.274 million, and then our property taxes we're estimating at 16.3 million. We get a report from the Josephine County assessor on our projection for property taxes, and so that's where that number comes from. Common School Fund is another fund that comes directly from the state at 612,000. Federal forest fees is at 200,000. That one's always a little bit iffy. Are we going to get it this year or not? But they did include it in the estimate for this year. And then teacher experience rating also plays a factor in the state school fund. So if you have older population of teachers, it gives you a little bit more of a priority on your funding. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to comment on. Last year we did a transfer out of the general fund into the bus replacement fund. And in looking at how those funds should be deposited, the auditors would prefer to see that as a reduction to the general fund of our state school fund, and then the state school funding amount going directly into the bus replacement fund. And those funds are coming from the depreciation of the buses that we've already purchased. And so it's a wash in how that looks. It's just, instead of doing it as an actual interfund transfer, it's just reducing the revenue to the general fund and then putting that revenue into the bus replacement fund. And then this slide just is a visual of where our state school fund has gone over the past few years. And so you can see the reduction that we're looking at this year, which, as we mentioned way too many times, is due to our declining enrollment. These are our sources of non-formula revenue. I won't go through all of them because you guys can read through them. I don't need to read every one of them. The most significant are our other local sources at the 850,000. That's where any of our E-rate funding is deposited. Any of our rebates that we get from our insurance companies go into that, like if we get a rebate from SAFE or our property and liability carrier, it goes into other local sources. And then ESD flow-through is really the biggest source of funding for our local revenue, and that's the flow-through. So ESD gets about 10% of the state school fund, and then they have to allocate that out to their districts. And districts can buy services from their ESD, and so it just depends on the complement of services your local ESD offers. The majority of services we purchase are special ed services, and there's a little bit of technology services that we purchase from them as well. And so whatever we don't spend of the allocation that they have based on the ADM for District 7, they flow through those dollars back to us. And so our estimate for this next year is about 1.7 million. So just a little bit of a reminder on ESSER, because we're going to be talking about that a little bit more as we get a little bit further into the presentation. ESSER 1 is the first round of money that we got from the federal government, and for us that was about $1.75 million. ESSER 2 was the second round of funding that we got. That was about $6.5 million. And then ESSER 3, or the American Rescue Plan funds, was the third round of money that we received, and that was about $14.5 million. Out of the ESSER 3, 20% of that has to be allocated toward learning loss, and so that's about 2.9-ish million. And we'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide, and we can show you how much we've spent out of that one. Oh, I have acceptable uses of COVID. This was one I had in the presentation last year, and I just kept it in here as a reminder of what we can spend COVID money on. One of the big ones was improving the HVAC systems in school districts, and so, as you know, we've spent a pretty significant amount on that, and we'll be talking about that a little bit further, about the transfer into the debt service fund out of the ESSER funds as well. There's a lot. We got money for summer learning. You can use money for mental health services, and then any activities that you need to maintain continuity of services. And so, as you know, we've talked about the need to use those funds to balance our budget just because of the declining ADM. I think this one shows that. So this shows our ESSER 1's completely spent out. We spent that out at the end of last year. ESSER 2, we have spent about 1.5 million. I'd set aside about 380,000, and I'll talk about some more that we're going to use in just a second. In ESSER 2, I have broken out the learning loss money. So ESSER 2 that we can spend on things outside of learning loss is about 11.7 million. And then the learning loss is the 2.9, and so that's how we get to the 14.5 million. Spent to date out of ESSER 3, we've only spent about $53,000 on the learning loss portion of that, and we have about 13,000 set aside for this year. So we have about 2.8 million left out of learning loss that we're looking at how we're going to spend that for this next year. So then when you continue down the chart, in looking at where we're short of funds for this school year, I'm estimating we're going to need about 2.6 to 2.8 million to finish out this school year and pay wages and do what we need to do. For this next year, 22-23, when you look at the loss of revenue combined with roll-up costs, it's about 5.9. I'm estimating it might be a little bit over 6 million that we'll need to spend. So I have an adjusted combined estimate for the deficit of 8.6 million, and then when we deduct that, and then the amount for learning loss, and then the reserve for debt service, that leaves us about 3.7 million of ESSER funds that we could spend or we could hold in reserve for 23-24. But ESSER 2 has to be spent out by the end of June of 23, and then ESSER 3 has to be spent out by June of 24. I know there are some school districts who have requested that they extend the deadline because they're doing some capital projects and they are not going to be done with those projects by the end of '24. So I don't know if that's going to be something that we're going to have that money for an additional amount of time or not. So more to come on that. And I don't know if you've heard anything about that.
Haven't heard anything different.
All right, moving on. So this is just a comparison of what our variances are, and this is on the revenue side. So comparing to last year on our non-formula revenue, we're about 185,000 lower. And then our state school fund, we're 1.95 million lower. Beginning fund balance, 2.4 million. Summer school, and this is the allocation we got for summer school last year compared to the allocation we're getting this year. We're about 442,000 less. And then with our ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funds, and this is just comparing what we received and what we have spent so far. So just comparing the two balances, we've used about 3.9, almost 4 million of that. All right, so moving on to our objects, and this is reflecting how the money is spent by object. And so as you can tell, functions, I'm not to object yet, sorry. So this is on our functions. So on our major functions, the majority of our funding is spent on instruction. Next is support services. We have a higher contingency because we still have some ESSER money out there. And then other uses and contingency and ending fund balance round out that. And there is, and I thought I had gotten you the updated one, Todd, so I'm sorry. The total should be 89,465,675, not 89,965. And that is because of that transfer of the 500,000 out of the revenue and the transfer out of the general fund, because I moved that over as just cash going into the fund. This one, yeah, get updated. And so the next slide just shows you the variances compared to, this is just listing each of them so you can read it a little bit better. So 46 million is instruction, 27 million in support services. In community services and facilities acquisition, the amounts there are really small because we didn't have anything that was budgeted in any of those areas. However, when we had our audit this last year, I had done an appropriation transfer from our Fund 100 into Fund 300 because we had to provide some of the ESSER funding to our private schools, and we didn't know that at the beginning of the year. So there had been nothing budgeted there, and the auditor said that you can't transfer money into a function where you didn't already have some money, which doesn't make any sense to me, but that was the auditor. So they said just put a couple of $1,000s in there, and then if you do have to make any adjustments, you've got some money in each of the function areas. So that's why those amounts look so small. Other uses, that is transfers and contingency and that kind of thing. Yeah, so we have contingency and then our ending fund balance at 6.171. And then our next slide is expenditures by major object. And again, this is just a representation of where the majority of our funding is spent. And as you can see, it's in salaries and associated payroll costs, which we are a service industry. And so it stands to reason that the majority of our budget would go to salaries and associated salary costs. And then you can see we have some in purchase services. In supplies, that went down a little bit. Last year we had, I think we're down about 1.5 million in supplies for this year because we had put so much in there with the ESSER money last year, and then we ended up not spending that much. And so then looking at what we think we'll need for supplies this year, we did see a pretty decent decrease there. And then the others are it's just another representation of how the funds are spent. And then our next slide shows that's really hard to read. This shows our general fund budget expenditure variances. And so Net staff salary and associated payroll costs are an increase of 2.9 million. All other expenditure categories are down about 200,000. And then the big reduction is in contingency and transfers because of the ESSER funds that we're using. So last year we had a really high contingency because we had the 20 plus million in ESSER funds. And so we don't have that to put in contingency this year because we're using that to balance the budget. And then our ending fund balance increase, we're looking at about $2 million increase in our ending fund balance. And I did make a note on here that part of the net staff and associated payroll cost savings are 1.6 million that we're saving in positions that we're not going to be filling next year. So if you look at this next slide, we are not replacing 6 elementary positions, and 5 positions are being replaced. And so at the elementary level, we're saving 750,000. At the middle school level, we're not replacing 4 teachers, but we are replacing 1. And so the net savings there is 296,000. At high school, we're not replacing 2, but we are replacing 2 different positions. And so our net savings there is 419,000, and then we're not replacing 1 administrator, and so the savings there is a little over 151,000. And so we wanted to put in some information about what do we do if our ADM does not start picking up over this next year and the following year after that. And so just some ideas that we would be looking at. We would probably look at another restructure of GP Flex, which is our online program. We're doing a little bit of a restructure this year, as you guys have heard about already. So that would be one thing we'd have to look at it again. And then looking at closing an elementary school, those are kind of dramatic reductions. If we don't get any students back, the district will have to look at some pretty dramatic steps that they'll have to take. We can eliminate 4th grade strings, 4th grade band. A day reduction is about, for the general fund, it's about 237,000, maybe closer to 250,000. And so day reductions would be something that you could look at too. And so just wanted to kind of keep those in front of you. I know we presented them at the last meeting that we had, that these were some of the options. And then in addition to that, we would also, so if we truly don't get a significant number of kids back, we would have to continue to evaluate our programs, our schools, our structure, and that kind of thing. I know Danny Cantola has gone through the process of having to close down an elementary school, and there are a lot of things that you would have to look at to do that. You'd have to bring your community together. We'd probably want to do another Portland State attendance study, just so that we could see kind of what that was looking like in our community now, because COVID has had an impact on who is still left in our community and just the dynamics in our community. So you'd probably want to do another Portland State study. You'd have to look at boundary adjustments. You'd want to look at what school made the most sense to close. And so there are a lot of considerations that you have to look at if you are going to go down the path of closing an elementary school. We would continue to look at attrition for savings, and then we would have to modify, obviously, class sizes as needed. And so those are some of the things that we would be looking at if we continue to have a large reduction in ADM. Also, along that path, if we're starting to recover some ADM, but not quite as quick as we wanted, we'd probably have to look at reduction in force. We would need to open negotiations. We could also reduce instructional days. None of these are awesome options, but they're all things that would need to be looked at. And so kind of compounding on one another from a large ADM loss to not so much ADM loss. And then, so I was kind of going backwards in how I was talking. So like I said, no ADM recovery would be looking at closing a school. So those are some of the pathways to sustainability. And so if we continue on with a large ADM reduction, the conversations will not be easy. And it will be a lot of discussions with our bargaining units as well as our community members, along with the school board and all of the administration. So just wanted to make sure that you guys are keeping those ideas in mind as well. So as we look at our other funds, as we've mentioned before, we have our federal programs. We're estimating about 8.3 million in federal programs. Student investment account, about 4.5 million. Measure 98, we haven't seen an estimate yet, so our estimate for this current year was 1.6 million. I do wonder if we're going to see a little bit of a reduction in both of those because of our reduction in ADM, so there will be more adjustments that need to be made to those funds as we go along, just kind of the same that we do with the general fund as we find out from the state what our funding is going to be. The student body fund I mentioned before, that's the fund that the students raise money for. They're estimating about 2.5 million in that fund. Food service, 4.3 million. Our cool schools, 155. PERS reserve, 3.36. Our bus replacement, debt service, and capital projects, which we've already talked about, and then our insurance reserve. And so outside of the general fund, our total funds are about 39.7 million. And now I am going to ask Trish if she would talk to us about student investment account and Measure 98, and that will give my voice a break. Thank you, Trish.
Hello. So the student investment account is the areas of allowable use. We can use the funds to reduce class sizes, to have a well-rounded education, increase instructional time, health and safety, and then the ongoing community engagement. We just, there'll be later on in a slide, we are trying to engage our community in an ongoing basis. When we first got the student investment account, we did a lot of different sessions that involved various stakeholders from our staff to parents and students to seek their input on specific strategies and activities that they wanted to see used with those dollars. This slide summarizes, well, it doesn't summarize it, details all of the things that we use the student investment account for. Currently, a huge chunk of it goes towards our social emotional needs for students with our behavior intervention specialists and the Stepping Stones program that's at Riverside Elementary. We contract with options for a lot of additional support, as well as Maslow, to help the needs of our homeless students. One thing that wasn't on that previous slide, just to point out, is the investment dollars are really supposed to be used for underserved, underrepresented groups. And for us, that means our special ed population, our homeless population, and our Hispanic second language learner population. And so a lot of these activities are related to specific strategies that come from those three sub-pops for us. The Discovery Program is a mental health support, our special ed coordinator really helping dive into the needs of our special ed students, the Equity Diversity Coordinator. We've added some teachers, some instructional assistants that helps increase that instructional time bit that you saw as a requirement of an allowable expense of SIA. We've reduced class fees, eliminated them. Buying school supplies, we've reduced pay-to-play fees, expanded our summer school, adding some tech support to help us with our data management so that we can really focus and target our student needs, and then professional development for our staff along with those HVAC upgrades as Sherry mentioned. Good. Want me to do high school success too? Yeah, high school success. Measure 98, interchangeable words, but the state really refers to it as high school success dollars. These funds, I think this is like year 4 or 5 with our Measure 98 dollars. And we use those to reduce our dropout rate. It's also, we're required to address chronic absenteeism, needs of our freshmen. We're required to run 9th grade success teams, and then look at our marginalized groups that are underperforming. So a lot of data used in this one too to identify the needs of our kids. We use these funds, I think it's the next slide. These things, the 1.6 million has paid for our ninth grade success coordinator. Also in that ninth grade success coordinator, there are student success mentors that work with her. There's also allocation for ninth grade student needs, materials, incentives, those kinds of things, as well as additional funds for teacher meetings around ninth grade on track. We expanded our health science program. It was our most popular health science, most popular program of study, and so now we have 2 teachers versus 1 in our health science program. The attendance intervention specialist really helps us with that chronic absenteeism at Grants Pass High School. We hired a credit retrieval teacher at Grants Pass High School to really help with our dropout recovery, and have seen good success with that. Our Spanish family liaison was an addition a number of years ago and has proved to be a valuable resource. We expanded our math support. That's where our students struggle the most, so we hired an additional 4/7 math teacher as well as a math tutor. Added a whole complement of SEL counselors at all 4 secondary schools. We can spend a certain percentage, I think it's 15%, of the 1.6 on middle school needs, and we do that with the SEL counselors. We pay for the majority of our college testing fees, all AP testing fees, PSAT, SAT, language testing, and then we've purchased a number of pieces of equipment for our career and technical ed programs that are established at Grants Pass High School. This is that summary of our survey. I think last time we came together, we shared with you that we were putting out a survey to our stakeholders, and wow, we were really surprised at the number of people who participated in that survey. We had 247 of our staff participate, 684 community members, and 105 of our students, middle and high school, participate in the survey. And what's interesting is if you took the survey, you noticed that it asked, what are your top 3 funding priorities? What do you think is most important? And for our staff and community, they were exactly aligned with each other. The number after represents the number of people who said that was their number 1 priority, so or first, second, or third priority. So class size came in top, both staff and community, mental health and wellness second, and then attending to career and technical ed needs third. For our students, it's those elective classes and expanding our elective classes, making facility improvements, and then supporting social emotional needs, which is aligned to that wellness and mental health. So kind of interesting to see how those priorities turned out on the survey we gave, and thanks to all those that responded. I think that gives you kind of a breakdown. It's awfully small, but it gives you, we asked demographic questions because one of the things we're supposed to do is engage those marginalized, underperforming subpopulations. And as I mentioned, that's our special ed population, our second language learners, and our homeless. We were really surprised at how many of our special ed students and parents participated in the survey, our best response to date. And we actually had a really good turnout on our second language learners. We actually, in years past when we've given the survey, we hadn't had many of our Spanish-speaking families participate, and 5 of our families took it in Spanish.
Thank you, Trish. One other comment too. One of the requirements for use of the ESSER funds was that we did have the same type of community engagement, and we showed that we demonstrated that. And they said that we could use the surveys that we were doing for SIA or Measure 98 would meet that criteria. And so that was why I wanted Trish to include the information that we had on the latest surveys that we had done. Early on in the pandemic, and actually prior to the pandemic, we had already been doing surveys for student investment account and Measure 98. And so all of those surveys that we have done over time are what have informed the choices that we have made as far as how budget dollars have been allocated. So just wanted to make sure that you guys knew that as well, that we were using those results as we were looking at our ESSER funds as well. So this is our capital projects budget, and you can see that we're estimating revenue of 6.7 million. A little bit of that comes from interest. I always put a placeholder in there for private donations because you have to account for that in your budget. So you have to account for the revenue and you have to account for the expenditure, even though it's not technically the district that's spending the money to do the project. And so I always put a placeholder in there because you never know when we're going to get a significant donation from someone. Construction excise tax, I'm estimating about 250,000. I think we're going to be close to that this year. Transfer from the general fund, we've been transferring about 600,000 from the general fund for several years now. Seismic grants, I put that in here because we have applied for seismic grants for Redwood Elementary and Lincoln Elementary. I'm crossing my fingers that we get those because that would not only help us seismically, but it would also replace the 2 roofs at each of those schools. So that will be awesome if we get those. And I think the results for those are supposed to come out mid this month. So as soon as we get the results on that, we'll let you guys know. We don't have any loan proceeds for the capital projects fund this year because we are done with the HVAC project, and I'm estimating a beginning fund balance of about 150,000. On the expenditure side, you can see the listing there of how much we're allocating at each school. Again, the big ticket allocations are at Redwood and Lincoln in the event that we get the seismic grants there. And then we do pay the debt service for our elementary classrooms that we did back in 2014. The debt service comes out of the construction excise tax and a portion of that out of the transfer from the general fund. And then we do have a small portion of salary that is paid out of the capital projects fund. It had in past years been a portion of James' salary. James was our former maintenance supervisor, and a small portion of my salary. And this budget just reflects a portion of actually Danny's salary, since he's going to be taking over the operations functions of my position. So that's what the salary piece is in that one. This just shows the total of the projects that we are looking at. And again, 5 million of that would be the 2 elementary schools if we get those funds. And then if you go to the next page, this shows actually what we are putting in the budget for capital projects this year. We're doing some automatic door openers at Grants Pass High School. And this is for any of our students with disabilities who need the ability to get into the door without having somebody hold the door open for them. So we currently have one student who's in a wheelchair that is independent, and so he needs to be able to open the doors on his own, and so he'll have a little key fob that he can use to open the doors. And so that's the major expense at Grants Pass High School. As you go down through the list, you'll see that we're doing a lot of gym floor refinishing. We're paying for those out of ESSER funding because the reason that the gym floors are in such horrible condition is because when we had to slim down our classrooms where we could only have so many kids in the classrooms, all of that stuff went into the gyms for storage and it beat up the floors. So we're going to use ESSER funding to do the gym reflooring. And then I also have put in $125,000 for recarpeting in the Performing Arts Center. For sure, we want to do the entryway and down the 2 main hallways. We need to get a couple of more quotes in to see just how far our dollars will go. And I know that there is a group in town that's working on getting some donations for the Performing Arts Center that we might be able to do a few other things as well there. So, and then anything else of significance, we're doing some asbestos removal and carpet replacement, but most of the things are pretty minimal projects that we're looking at this year, and mainly just because we're shorter on resources this year than we have been in prior years. So the next slide I have, and I know you guys have seen this slide like 8 million times, it feels like, as we talk about prioritization of the remaining ESSER funds. And so if we do transfer the 4 million into the debt service fund, and we use the funds as we have indicated previously in the presentation to help balance the budget, we will have about 3.7 million left over. That money can be used for some of the projects that had been identified last year as priorities for the ESSER funding, or we could hold up on doing any of the projects and kind of see where ADM takes us this year. So these are what we had looked at previously, and we have listed them more in the priority that we would like to see. So if we don't get the seismic grants, we really need to do the Lincoln and the Redwood roofs. And then the Grants Pass High School gym doesn't have cooling in it, as I mentioned before. And so there are times during summer when the kids are in there practicing, and as they first start into school in September when the weather is still really hot, that they can't use the gym because the heat index gets too high. And so that was put, those are, to me, those are kind of like infrastructure priorities that I think we can't ignore, especially the roofs. We can't ignore those too much longer. And then we had talked about doing bathroom renovations, and so these would be renovations at Grants Pass High School, at North and South Middle School, and these would be more gender-neutral bathrooms where they would have lockable stalls. And then the wash area, kind of the common area, would be more open to the hallway so that as staff are walking by, they can see the kids, not in the stalls, of course, but you know, where they're washing their hands and that type of thing. As you guys know, there is some bullying that goes on in the bathrooms and other things that we don't want to have go on in the bathroom. And so this would give more of a line of sight in that hand washing area. And so that would be the thought behind that. Last year we did present kind of what that would look like to the budget committee. So there are some plans that have been drawn that we could accommodate Grants Pass High School, North Middle School, and South Middle School. Next on the list are North and South Middle School tracks. Anybody who has lived here very long and has had kids go through our schools know those tracks are pretty much unusable. The kids do all of their track meets here at Grants Pass High School, and they can do minimal practicing at their schools just because of the condition of the field and the tracks. There's a lot of drainage work that needs to be done at both of those locations, as well as it would be great to have an actually all-weather surface at each of those so that we could actually have our own track meets there. And then the other, we had put down outdoor covered classroom play areas, and we had included those because those were allowable uses of the ESSER funds. One of the big priorities outside of HVAC, like I said, that was kind of the number one priority from ODE and OHA is working on your HVAC, but also having classrooms that were outside where kids would be able to be outside of the classroom and more out in the fresh air. And so that's why we had included that as a priority. And so then the next page, it gives you a budget for each of the schools for what each of those would be. And so you can see what the cost of the bathrooms at the high school would be, the HVAC and the covered school areas that we summarized on the page before. You can see those at each location. And that's about, all of those in total are about 16.9 million. And then the next slide, I always include this because I get questions from the community about, well, why don't you guys just pay for all this yourself? Like, why don't you go out and find the money? And why do you always come to the community and ask for money? And so this is just to show the community that we do leverage every source of funding that we can. A lot of seismic grants, we've taken out loans. I need to update that for the loan that we took out for the HVAC system. Facility grants, the Booster Club, Senate Bill 1149, a lot of money from E-rate. We get hazardous waste removal grants from the city of Grants Pass, and that helps us with, if we have smaller, like asbestos removals or things like that we have to do, the city helps us with that. We had a solar panel project several years ago, refinancing the bond investment returns, and then some reductions from our safe modification rating when back in the day when we kind of revamped our safety program and we saw such significant results. We got almost $1 million back from SAFE on that, and we did use a portion of that to go back into facility improvement needs that we had at that time. And so I always like to include that one, just so that folks know that we actually do look for money everywhere we can get funding, especially for our facility projects. And I think, oh, and then summary of changes. So like I mentioned earlier, in the final budget document, you will see the reflection of the reduction of the general fund revenue and the reduction of the transfer into the bus replacement fund. And that's so that we can just put the revenue straight into that fund. And then I reduced the SIA transfer by $250,000. When it was originally entered into the system, it was put in at $500,000, which was an error. And so that will be reflected in the final budget document. And I need to work with Ryan Thompson doing a final review of the budget. I saw that there was a interfund transfer of $25,400 in Fund 150, and I don't know why they did that. And so we just need to remove that. I think it was just an error when they were looking at the revenue codes that they could put their funding in. I think it was just a mistake on their part. So I just need to fix that. But I need to work with Ryan on that so that we put it in the right areas. And then in Fund 280, after I had run the budget document, it looks like someone had the ability to get in there and add another $2,000 in Fund 280. And so I need to do an adjustment in Fund 280 as well. So those are the summary of changes that compared to the document that you have that I will be making in the final budget document. And now I think that's it. Thank you guys for being here. As always, I appreciate you guys very much. You guys know that we couldn't do what we do without all of you being here and helping us. So I'll open it up for questions. I know we have one person online. I don't know if she's submitted any questions yet. Todd? Any other questions? I know I just threw a whole ton of information at you guys, so.
Budget committee members have any questions for Sherry on the document? Yes, Gary?
Well, this is actually from the last meeting. We had a list of things we couldn't talk about.
Yep,
Could you review that for me?
you can talk about anything now,
Okay, but we weren't supposed to talk about
specific line items.
line items,
Right.
but today we can talk about any line item.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. One of the slides talked about the reduction in ADMW per student, and it looks like it's about 9% or so. I'm just wondering why that is.
The reduction of ADM.
Is that per student, or is that our total
Oh, no,
reduction?
that's our total reduction.
Okay.
So our ADM's down about 9-ish, 10%. And that's total student population.
I see. Okay.
Any other budget committee members? I have a number of questions, but yep, go ahead.
I'm sorry I was late. Did we talk about process?
We do have, and I asked Danny if he would talk about that, and he's gone. So Susan, do you want to talk about it? I know, well, Danny told me that they are seeing, we just started kind of a campaign on, getting.
I got the
folks
flyer
to-
in the mail today. I
Yes,
saw
we
it,
sent a
so-
flyer, we've done a radio thing, we've done a newspaper thing, and we are starting to see some enrollments come in. And he had shared some numbers with me, but not written down, so I hope Susan has those.
Well, that's what I'm looking for. I will tell you one thing that I have that I worked on today. Our principals have been working on contacting all of our students who are in, let me backtrack. We have a list of families who registered for homeschooling from January 2020 forward. So of those students, there are 223 that that conceivably live in District 7 and could be going to District 7 schools. And so we've been working on contacting those families. We, meaning the principals, are making personal phone calls to them. So we have 6 of those families that we have had contact with. There are 16 who have either returned or are planning on returning. The majority we're having a really hard time being able to contact. Phone numbers aren't working, emails aren't working, that sort of thing. Almost 40 of them have moved out of state, most of them out of state, a couple of just locally out of the area, but most of them out of state. 45 are continuing in homeschool. Anyway, the bottom line is it's a small percentage of those students who are saying they're going to come back into our schools. Right now it's at 16. There are still 60 that we're still trying to get a hold of in some form. So maybe some of those. That's the
What was
then-
the major age of those students? Is it mostly elementary?
Well, elementary is the biggest percentage of students that we've lost ADM, but of those particular numbers, I didn't sort it by that, so I could, but I haven't. This is what Danny was going to share, that in just the 3 days since we've opened up enrollment, we have 18 new enrolled students, so not kinders, but so truly new students. We have 41 interdistrict transfer requests for new slots, and those are not students who are here on remainder of the year. So again, truly new to us students. And then he had on there the 11 students coming back to us from homeschooling. It's, like I said, it's 16, so a few more than that. So if I do a quick math, it's about 65 new to us students, and we just opened registration 3 days ago. Hopefully you received a postcard in the mail. We did a blanket postcard to every residence in the District 7 area. We have newspaper ads running, and we also have radio ads running during drive time. So we're trying to do some recruiting.
Last question. With regards to the elementary students, do we see that one school has been hit harder than the other? Is this an equal distribution, or is,
Equal distribution.
Thank you, Susan.
Chairman? No, I don't have any more. Thank
Okay,
you.
I have a few questions, if I might. I'd like to go back to a few of the slides, Sherry.
Okay.
The one is historical ADMW, kind of ties into Scott's question. And I just wanted to clarify on that slide, we have ADMW going back to 2010-11. And going down to 21-22, it shows ADMW of 7117. That's actually a budgeted number, is that right?
Yes.
And the actual number for that year, according to latest updates, is more like 6,400 and change, 6,400 plus, is that
Yes.
right? So
Yep.
we've actually been experiencing this ADMW decline in real terms, not budgeted terms, for a couple of years now. Is that right? In terms of, if you go back to 7154
Yes.
in 2021?
Yes, they held us harmless during the COVID period.
Right.
But
So-
they did not hold us harmless for this year.
And the revenue impact was mitigated somewhat because of the look-back rule and the state school fund
Yes.
approach. Okay, so going to the slide that talks about pathway to sustainability and the savings attrition block versus the additional budget reduction box on that page, can I clarify that the only thing included in the proposed budget we're considering tonight for approval is the attrition savings?
Yes.
That's what's baked into the variance amount on payroll and other costs as an offset to what would be the roll-up number and other staff cost increases.
Yep, that's
Okay.
correct.
Thank you. And so we're talking about these other reductions, and I think it's important to this committee this evening, in the process of considering whether to approve this budget, to take a look at that list and to put it into context, because we're not talking, at least without discussion and recommendation by this committee, to include any of these restructuring or elementary school closure or strings band, et cetera. That's not in this document. And yet I do believe that we have to be very aware of the potential reality of some of these if state school funding for this district does not increase over the next year. So my general question to Sherry, just looking forward for a year and taking a look at the budget, if we took out beginning fund balance resources and ESSER funds, which have been fully allocated in the proposed budget, and they, although there's some remaining in the ending fund balance for the general fund, if we take a look at next year and just take a look without our ending fund balance next year, we will be deficit spending next year, isn't that right?
Yeah.
So we're looking at a proposed budget that still relies on federal money to keep things going for one more year. The question becomes, given the time constraints on those federal monies, as we talked in our general concept meeting a few weeks ago, is this fall and a year from this fall. Is that correct? Or is that, when do those ESSER funds have to be spent?
In June of '23 and June of '24.
June of 23 and June of 24. So we will have some left in the ending fund balance, but it looks like, barring something substantive changing on the ADMW front, we will be exhausting those funds most likely in the 23-24 year. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
other than the 3.7 million.
So that gets me to the point that I think this committee does need to consider. And one of my questions related to this subject, Sherry, is what flexibility does a district have with regard to fund transfers that are currently being made to support debt service and capital projects if a year from now this body gets together and they say, wow, ADM hasn't come back as much as we'd hoped, and yes, we wanted to shore up debt service so we could continue to maintain the full faith and credit of this district, which is important and it's critical. And oh yes, that laundry list of capital projects are really important and they're prioritized and we have to do some. Can this body consider next year trying to tap into some of those funds, or is that once they're in capital project and debt service, that's where they lie and they can't be used indirectly or indirectly to supplant or supplement a general fund expenditure?
The board could pass a resolution to transfer those funds out of that fund. There are a little bit more restrictions on the debt service fund, and so we would have to be careful about that. The capital projects fund, you have, pretty much ultimate flexibility in that fund to, if you needed to not make the transfer out of the general fund into capital projects, you could do that.
So we look at the summary of those other funds, PERS reserve is always there, even though that amount is appropriated this year, it doesn't have to be spent. That PERS reserve can be sitting there to help step into a breach.
Yep.
The capital projects money could be used or earmarked if it's not spent this next year to step into that breach, and there may be some restrictions or further consideration have to do with regard to debt service. That may be more restricted.
And the PERS reserve fund, I always allocate out the majority of that fund in the event that there is something catastrophic that happens during the year, so there is flexibility to spend those funds. So that's kind of like the fallback fund for the district. It has been in years prior anyway, and we just have not had to use it.
I believe that the budget committee can be a little more relaxed in approving a budget that moves substantial dollars out of the general fund into these other funds if they know that down the road, this is a fluid situation. We had an update this evening from Susan. You guys are out beating the bushes. Some kids are gone for good. Some kids are coming back. Some new kids are coming in. So as the administration goes through this next year, they're going to be monitoring that situation. They'll be monitoring state school fund updates. They'll be monitoring any federal money that comes up. But in that process, what would be good to know is that we have some pedals we can push or buttons we can push to try to maximize resources available should the fiscal picture darken or not improve sufficiently as we turn the corner to 2023.
Right. We also have the student investment account money too, and so there is a little bit of flexibility in there in that, one of the approved uses of those funds is for health and safety, and so we're doing the $250,000 transfer out of that fund into the debt service fund, and so there is some flexibility. You just have to make sure that you're staying under the umbrella of what the state has said that they want those funds spent for.
I think the importance of this point in the Budget Committee looking at how vital ESSER funds are to keeping things going this next year is the flexibility on how this district uses the fund. Sherry estimates $3.7 million of ESSER money will be left at the end of this next budget year to carry forward. But if you put that into context with the budget ending fund balance of the general fund, that those monies and funds are fungible, as Gary Richardson knows, that represents about 60% of our ending fund balance is comprised of ESSER funds. In other words, if the ESSER funds weren't there,
Right.
that's what we would have left in just general funds. So I think it's that, that's an important piece. So I think you've answered all my questions. Do you have any other questions by committee members, just from a general strategy period?
So I'm looking at the ADM weighted chart.
Yep.
I think that's the one John was referring to. So for this next year, we're looking at 6,500. And if I go back in time, I have to go back to somewhere around 2013, 14. In terms of staffing or employee levels, I know this is an unanswerable question, but I'm just trying to get some idea of how much has our staff grown in terms of head count compared to that period of time, which would have been equivalent ADMW.
I can't tell you off the top of my head, Gary. We have grown substantially since 2013 in staffing, and so, but I can't give you an exact number of what that would look like.
And you're right, we can't answer that tonight. When you take into a student investment account, measure $98, and these other funds that are all new since then account for a significant amount of staff increases.
Right, but as we're trying to keep one eye on the future and hope that that's not the actual future that we're going to get to, I'm trying to figure out how long until we get there. In other words, we have these various pools of money, and we're going to use some of them next year. Maybe we can use a little bit of them the year after that. But if things don't change significantly, in other words, I'm trying to figure out, how do I know that the glide path is a good one and not one that's going to require us to do layoffs or some of these fairly obnoxious budget reductions?
I think we have about a year to plan for that, don't we? I mean, as we look forward to the future,
Yeah.
we'll know where our ADM kind of settles out, and I suspect that whatever we see in our numbers this year will likely be what is reflected in years to come. We're not expecting a significant drop-off or increase, I would suspect, right? I mean, we're hoping that things will be back to normal. Our ADM should be, whatever it turns out to be in this upcoming September and October, I suspect is what we can base our numbers moving forward on. And if we really do settle out at 6,500 students, if that is where we stand, I think maybe the question that I would have is, well, then how much staff do we need to run an operation with 6,500 students as opposed to 7,200 students? And will that cost savings help offset some of the issues that we may have? And instead of layoffs or firings, can we just allow natural attrition? How many retirements do we have coming up? Can we continue to restructure, distribute our resources to continue to do what we need to do for a smaller pool of children? And that's what I would hope we would be looking at over the next year as we try to navigate these tough times that we have, however we'd like to describe it.
Exactly. In other words, our attritions, do attritions happen at a rapid enough rate that we can get there without having to do the layoff stuff? That's the kind of projection I'm looking at.
Sometimes they do, Gary. It just depends on the year. This year, we saw a pretty decent number of retirements, and then some folks that just left the district for other jobs elsewhere. And so it kind of depends. I know there's a lot of COVID fatigue out there. People are tired, and we might see more retirements as we go into this next year. But we don't know that. That's such a personal decision for people that they don't show their hand on, I think I'm going to retire this next year. I think we've only heard from a couple of people who are going to finish out this next school year and then are going to be done. And so it's a tough question to answer. And
I don't think attrition by itself, even if it continues at the current pace, is going to be sufficient to stop the deficit tsunami that the district will face if ADMW does not increase significantly. And I think that's all borne out, on page 12 of the budget document. You take a look at the net salary and associated payroll cost increases of 2.936 million. That's after 1.6 million of attrition savings. So do the math, you're at $3.5 million roughly in roll-up costs. So you're still looking at $3 million, even with attrition savings. And when your ending fund balance is overly reliant on one-time federal money, I hope they give schools across the country more. I hope Salem gives K-12 more funding. Those are all moving pieces. And I agree with Scott that I think by late fall, certainly by the end of this calendar year, we'll have a pretty good idea where the ADM ship is going to settle. But at that point, it's going to be necessary to revisit some of these ugly options that Sherry has on that other box and on that slide. And more so, I think it's going to require, as administration moves through the school year, they're going to be ready to be nimble to respond to things such as not making that capital expenditure, looking for other ways to not use contingency this year. So that falls to the ending fund balance. It's going to be a very challenging year to be monitoring and to be nimble in responding, so that if things don't readily approve, and I think it's going to take a while for that ADM to rejuvenate, probably several years. That's why the only proposal in the proposed budget, the only item that gives me little hesitancy is locking too much into a special fund that can be accessed down the road. Because, for example, the debt service has got about almost 4 years worth after this transfer in there. And that's great, because we have to maintain the credit rating of the district. We want to go out and borrow money in the future for capital needs, et cetera. It's extremely important. But by the same token, we say, well, 3 years is enough until we know where we stand, because that 1 year debt service is equal to every strings and band and whatever. I mean, it's not a direct relation, but it does put it into context that now, if we can go in and say, you know what, we took a big chunk and moved it to debt service, we put nearly 4 years of debt service money away last year to be prudent and conservative, but now we would like to go in and grab $500,000 of that to be able to maintain strings and band or some other program, then that's why I was asking Sherry, is that something we could do? And if not, or if it's problematic, I think I would at least raise the possibility that the transfer from the general fund into the debt service, not so much capital projects, because that sounds like it's a lot more flexible, maybe be revisited and maybe taken down a bit so we keep our powder somewhat more dry in the general fund.
Well, that is I guess that's kind of the next part of my other question, which is this reserve for debt service, the $4 million. So when we took out the loans, are you including the kindergarten loan or just the air quality stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we took out that loan, it was with the expectation that the district can adequately service the debt.
Right.
Essentially creating a reserve and saying, we're not sure we can adequately service the debt, spooks me a little bit. In other words, I think our budget should be built without needing that debt service chunk to be put somewhere because we think the district has the ability on an ongoing basis to service the debt we took out.
And I would agree with you if we hadn't lost so much ADM, and that's the issue, Gary, is when you lose as much ADM as we have, you don't have the available resources that we thought we were going to have when we took the loan out. And so it's a little bit of a conundrum, because if we don't spend the $4 million, so let's say we don't transfer it to the debt service fund and we just let it fall to the ending fund balance of the general fund, we have to spend it by 2024. And so what are you going to spend it on? So we can let it fall to the general fund, and then you guys can look at it next year and say, okay, I'm going to transfer it to the debt service fund now. That does not feel like a good option to me either. And we've already submitted to ODE to transfer it to the debt service fund, and they approved that as part of an approved ESSER, use of the ESSER funds. And so I don't know what you would do with the $4 million if you're not going to use it to help service the debt of the HVAC system.
So it sounds like if you move it to the debt service fund, it cuts the string from ESSER funds because it's an approved use. But if you later pull it out of there, does the string come back?
We'd have to let ODE know what we were doing with it, just as we've done all the way along with the ESSER funding, because as you know, things don't always cost exactly what you think they're going to cost when you decide to do the project, right? And so, there have been some things that we've had to go back to ODE and say, hey, we didn't exactly spend this much here, we spent it here, and, is that approved, and can we still get our ESSER reimbursement for that? So, yeah, we'd have to talk to ODE and let them know what we were doing.
So I think I'm going to say I don't think you get to take it back out. I think you have to use it for that, because they could easily say at that point in time either no or sorry, you missed the deadline, give us the money back.
But the money's already there, right?
Yep.
So we can't, so the money's there. So that's where the money has been placed already?
Well, it's not in our debt service fund yet. We have not requested the $4 million from ODE yet. It would be
That was a
transferred this
good
next year.
question, though, related to Gary's point. OD's approved the movement into the debt service fund of these ESSER funds to service this debt. Does that satisfy the 2024 timing
Yep.
deadline?
Yep.
So that's a point on, it seems to me that, and the other point I would make, and we know this historically, that to the extent the district puts money into special revenue funds for a specific purpose that can be justified and supported, it also takes pressure off administration when it comes to collective bargaining if there's too much money sitting in a general fund reserve that's not earmarked. And I remember this specifically when some of our PERS reserves and other reserves were set up, but there was no pushback because it was for the employee's own benefit that we're putting it in. Now, this happens to be a district credit rating benefit, but the only point I'd like to raise is the amount, not the concept. I think the concept is well-founded. I think it moves it in. I would be reluctant to move probably as much in with the idea that once it goes in, it's in. And you probably would have to jump through some ODE hoops and other hoops to say, oh, we'd like some of that back in the general fund, and then to raise the timing issue as to expenditure and all that. That would be something I'd like the committee to toss.
Right. So we should consider it once it's in there, that's where it's going.
Right. That's what
Not the idea that that's some pool that we can draw from later for problems we're having elsewhere.
And if we do choose to do a lower amount than that, then we would just have to I would have to tell ODE, we're not going to do a $4 million transfer, we're going to do $2 million transfer. And
It's
they
$1
would
million
probably
a
be okay
year
with that.
for the debt service, right? Is that what I
It's
remember?
1.2.
1.2. So if we were to put in 2.4 or 3.6, that would at least cover us for 2 to 3 years down the road. Is that-
Yes, and so we also have 250,000 coming out of SIA. We have 130 to 150,000 a year coming from our Cool Schools Fund. And then included in the general fund, we do have a $350,000 transfer also into the debt service fund. And so you wouldn't, so it extends out the life of the 4 million that you would be able to use that money to help offset the debt.
Okay.
And it's kind of just looking forward, I guess, looking at the health of the district and not knowing where ADM is going to shake out and where the state school fund is going to shake out over time. And, having some security there that buys us some time for paying that debt. I don't know. I'm always going to lobby to have the money in the debt service fund just because I think it's the fiscally responsible thing to do when you're looking at all of the other issues that we're looking at.
Well, so one of the decisions for the budget committee is when are we going to make the decision to get on track with the 80M drop that we've seen? And it sounds like we a little bit have two choices. One would be to get on that track this budget year. The other one, which it sort of sounds like this budget is built for, which is to use this year to gather more data, to figure out what that trajectory looks like. That sounds okay if it's not going to be just next year that we have to make the adjustment. So does it look like we're going to get it more than essentially 2 years before we're going to have to get to our new ADMW level?
And that is really hard to predict, Gary. I think like we've talked about here for a long time, we don't know until, we really won't know until September, the end of September, what our ADM is going to look like for this next school year. We'll have an idea as we go through the rest of this year because we'll have people, start contacting us about registering their kids and doing enrollment. So we will have a better idea of that. I feel like because COVID was such a dramatic event, that's something that we've never experienced before, I don't feel that it's unreasonable to let the district take this year to assess and see what we can do to get the ADM back, look at what the state is going to do as far as funding education. Are there going to be other funds available? I mean, they've already rolled out the recruitment and retention grant as additional funding for us. And so, taking this year to watch what the state does and to let the district do the hard work that they know that they need to do to bring kids back, I feel like that's the fair thing to do. And yet I'm just telling you, this is Sherry's opinion about that. And you guys could totally disagree with that. But COVID was something we've never dealt with before. And to take a knee-jerk reaction this year and say, okay, I don't want you to use any of the ESSER money to help balance the budget. I want you to deal with it within the budget. That is super draconian, and I feel like that's not a fair direction to go. I don't know. I'll throw that out to you guys.
Are there any levers we get to flip during the year? Let's say we get to next September or October. Is there any adjustments we get to make?
Yes.
Mid-year?
The state will start making adjustments on, so let's say our ADM does start improving and we start seeing more kids come back. Then our state school funding will start being adjusted in January. And sometimes they even do it sooner. This last year, they did it even in November. And as other districts you can go in and change the estimates for your ADM. And so as other districts, if they see kids coming back, or if they see property taxes increasing, or that they think that kids are not going to come back, all of that's going to affect the state school fund. And so when significant changes happen, ODE adjusts the amount of funding that each district gets. The state could choose also to put some more money into the state school fund. We'll get a true adjustment in January. And so if we've seen an uptick of ADM, they will adjust our funding and we will get additional money in January. They'll do that again in March. And so there are a couple points there where we'll be able to see what's happening to our funding level. And so as the district is moving along, they'll be able to monitor that and they can make adjustments throughout the year. And so, I mean, if it looks like we're getting the, 50 kids back that Susan just said, and that's it. Okay, we'll figure that in. We'll know that'll give us the increase of that much money. And then we'll look at what we need to do. The district will have to probably call the union into bargaining early. They're scheduled to go into bargaining in March. They'll probably have to call the union into bargaining earlier, probably November or December, and start those hard discussions about what does that look like for this year. That is a tough road to hoe, and you guys all know that's a hard road to go down when you're looking at making adjustments to COLA or STEP or insurance or any of the benefits that the employees get. Can you go down in staff mid-year? Yeah. Then you would just have to increase class sizes at every school in the district. If we look like we need to start ripping more people sooner, we definitely can do that. That's always an option to do that. And so there are points in the year that the district will have checkpoints that they can look at as far as, is funding looking like it's on the upswing? Is it looking like it's flat? Do we really need to start, making some tough decisions as they're going out through the year? For sure. And you know that they'll be doing that because they don't like this position that we're in any better than you guys do.
To your point on that
Yeah.
question, just because, again, with these ESSER funds and some of the timelines and it being kind of a one-time thing, the question that I have is, while I absolutely understand putting 4 million into the reserve for the debt service and in agreement with the concept behind it, kind of like John had mentioned, once those funds are allocated towards that, we're not pulling those back out potentially. And if we have till 2024 to spend them, there be potential value in only putting a portion towards the debt service this year, giving us some flexibility to see if we need to allocate those funds differently next year. And if it turns out we don't need to, then putting that again towards that original purpose, but giving some breathing room and flexibility at least over the next year.
Yep, we could do that. I would just let ODE know that that's what we were doing.
Sherry, can you clarify? I've heard 4 million and I've got 4.73 million in the revenue line over in the debt service fund for
Right.
transfers. What amount's coming out of the general fund this year? What do you?
So the 4 million is the ESSER money, which is in the general fund, and then 350,000 is coming out of the general fund. 150,000 is coming out of, no, not SIA, whole schools, and 250,000 is coming out of SIA.
So what's the pure ESSER component of the 4.7 million?
4.
4, okay.
Yep.
Okay, so one way to approach it would be if we took a 3-year debt service number, 3 times 1.2 is 3.6. If we said we'd like to have 400,000 in there, we could take all the other contributing funds and then just reduce the ESSER contribution to that total of 4 million. Is that right? Okay. And we would have to let OD know, and we have to make sure that the budget committee is aware that next year you're going to have to spend that before the end of June 2024.
Right.
Downside maybe being that if you enter into collective bargaining agreements, you do your projections for ending fund balance next year, and they may say, hey, you can still afford to give us something, COLAs, this, whatever. Okay. Other questions regarding that particular point, which is really the level of inter-district transfer into a fund that maybe is going to be, sounds like restricted to that use going forward and may at the margin limit some flexibility for the general fund. Debbie?
Well, so I'm a little bit uneasy. It's still a miracle to me that we moved forward and got this HVAC together and got it in place in a timely manner especially with construction costs skyrocketing. I know that the Redwood roof was like at $500,000 and now it's at $1 million. And so getting those HVAC systems in place saved us a lot of money. The ESSER funds, I think, is my understanding that one of the main hopes for that money at the federal level was to actually pay for some HVAC kinds of systems. And so it just seemed like, boy, we really did something right. Here's some money that's actually coming from the feds for this purpose, and it takes some pressure off of our general fund balance to pay for this. Since our community said, we want you to figure out a different way to pay for this than a bond. And so I feel a little bit disappointed to hear a conversation about putting less money into that fund, because that's what I really feel that money should be spent for. So that's kind of, I thought I would just put my position out there.
Brian?
Just trying to wrap my head around this. So it sounds like we have budgeted for about $750,000 of the debt service annually aside from the ESSER funds. Is that between all those other resources? So that would mean approximately, roughly $500,000 would need to be coming from ESSER. So I'm trying to understand why we wouldn't, with all the things that are in flux, why we wouldn't just do $500,000 from ESSER this year and then see what the picture looks like next year. And if we need to allocate the other 3.5 next year, we can, but keeping those funds flexible until then, just because having them flexible is better than having them not flexible.
That's always an option.
Okay.
I think John had just pointed out, though, that having that extra funding in your end fund balance gives the potential for teachers in the union to say, well, there's money there, and instead of putting it towards your debt service, you need to put it towards us.
Can those ESSER funds be used for those things? Okay.
I agree with you, Debbie. I think this is what these funds should be used for. There's really a timing difference in terms of the unknowns we're facing for the next year. If we were to reduce it by some amount and let ODE know, and then you come back next year and say, you know what, we're going to put the rest of that money in we still would likely get that approval and we would still meet the time deadline for expending those funds. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm not married to any recommendation to reduce the amount of interfund transfer. When I was reviewing the budget document, I saw that was a large dollar item that was moving this year into a fund that I thought we might have less flexibility to consider 6 months from now, or the board 6 months from now, the budget committee a year from now, should circumstances have us looking at some pretty austere options.
So playing up Debbie's comment about the air quality, and given my just recent past comments, I know this is going to seem odd, but we still have a couple schools that we didn't really get the air quality upgrades finished, and they're not in our current budget.
So you're talking about Redwood and Lincoln, and they do have HVAC systems. They're just not as new as the systems that we have now. And so, yes, there are some upgrades that, when we have the money to do that, would be great to be able to do those. But at least they do have functioning HVAC systems where they have cooling, heating, and, ventilation.
Given the conversations we had at the board level about making the schools to the same standard, clearly those two schools needed an upgrade to get the same kind of air quality standards that we just installed for our other schools. But at any rate, I think I'm making the pitch to do the upgrades for those two schools, and the reason for that goes back to at the time we were talking about COVID, but every spring we get reports at the board level of 20 to 25, 30% absences, depending on the year, for several weeks during the spring. And much of that could be attributed to poor air quality in the classrooms. In other words, the kids are very transmissible. We're not getting a lot of ventilation, and so a lot of them get sick, and then we lose a whole bunch of instructional time. And my rough calculation at the time was we could almost get the equivalent of 5 instructional days by improving the air quality at our schools. And clearly we've done that, except for these 2, which really won't have the air quality that we just did for the other ones. So I'm kind of making the pitch to finish it, and that's partially why I was looking at the $4 million of ESSER fund.
Well, to do both of those schools, it would be almost $9 million to do the upgrades. And so we can't afford that, Gary.
Cheaper option, Gary, would be to have them wear masks.
But Sherry, you told me it was only going to be, what was that, $3.7 million or something?
I know, that was back before COVID, and that was back before prices skyrocketed, and we can't get anything, and we can't get people to put them in. I can't believe how much costs have escalated, but just over this 2-year period of time. I mean, we can all hope that the costs will come back down, and it won't be so onerous to do that, but yeah.
Went from almost 4 to 9
Yep,
for the same thing.
yep.
How much are those 2 middle schools now?
To do new ones?
Yeah, the ones we thought we were trying to build.
The 2, a middle school's probably what, 60 million-ish? I don't know.
I think it was, yeah, right now.
48 million, I don't know, I don't remember, Gary.
That number's pushing closer to 100 million right now for a new middle school.
Too bad we didn't manage to pull that off.
Yeah, Brian? You had a question?
Oh, I don't want to move off topic.
No, we have any other comments on the inter-district transfer fund vis-a-vis the debt from general fund to debt service fund and at least the consideration? And I don't think it's anybody's married to this strongly, but the consideration that putting more money into the debt service fund may preclude a certain amount of flexibility if a year from now we need to reconsider use of those monies. Again, the proposed transfer, if I did my math right, is there's nearly 4 years worth of debt service coverage handicap will be in the balance going forward into next year. So we can come back and reach a consensus before we make a motion. And I do want to talk about the transfer of the capital projects fund in a little more detail, but go ahead.
Well, I guess just to finish up my thought on that topic, I would probably be more in favor of putting $500,000 or $1 million in that debt service as opposed to 4 personally. One of the items that you proposed for additional reductions next year if needed was a restructuring of GP Flex. I was just wondering if someone could maybe describe what that might look like.
I'm not sure they know what that would look like. We haven't had a ton of discussion about additional restructuring of GP Flex. We're doing some of that this year. As you guys know, we went down to the administrator. So I don't think anybody has had any major discussion about what else we could do with GP Flex.
What we could do or what we are doing?
Well, there was a slide in here that said we could save possibly up to an additional $1 million by doing some sort of additional restructuring and, okay, that's a different word than restructuring. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
What would our ADM do if we eliminated it? How many students would we lose, assuming that they wouldn't come to class? So we're spending $1 million for GP Flex to educate 90 kids about, is that right? Okay.
I had a question about the roofs and the seismic grant. So if we get the seismic grant for 5 million, does that mean that we won't need to pay for the million for each roof, that the seismic grant will pay for those pieces?
That's correct, and so that's one that's kind of sitting out there, we're waiting to see. So we
Okay.
do have some flexibility there. Before we move off the $4 million topic, we did have a comment come in from a patron, Kelly Robinson, commented if the debt is accruing interest, we should do what we can to reduce that as soon as possible, so. Just a
Is the
comment on-
interest rate fixed on the debt?
It is,
Okay.
And it was 1.9%, if I remember right.
yeah.
So that's a great interest rate.
Yeah, I had a few more things.
Sorry.
Oh, it's all good. One was, this is maybe more in relation to the SIA funds. I know last year for elementary, we provided all of the school supplies for the elementary students. Is that budgeted for again this year?
We're doing that this year, and that's in the general fund this year.
Okay, awesome. Got that one. Oh, there was a discussion earlier this year about the fees for volunteers, and that discussion was referenced to come back around during budget time. So I was just wondering if this budget allows for the district to have the ability to waive fees for parents and people to volunteer.
For volunteers, I did not include anything in the budget specifically for that.
Do you have an idea of how much that might be?
Oh, gosh, it depends. So the fingerprinting fee is like $60. And then they have the background check fee. Yeah, so it's about $75, $80.
What we've been doing currently is any parent or it doesn't have to be a parent, any person who has expressed that that is a hindrance, then we continue. So we've just been doing it as needed. We just did it with some outdoor ed volunteers.
Okay, that's fair. I don't know that everyone that may want to volunteer might express that concern, so it seems like it might be an insignificant amount. It sounds like it might be like $5,000,
If we did it for all of our volunteers, we usually have about 900 volunteers a year. It's about $70,000 if we did it for everyone.
Okay, well, that's a little bit more than I thought, so I guess the current system is good. Earlier, well, I brought up a topic a few months ago about at North Middle School, the doors on the A building on the north side. I just happened to be there because my daughter goes there, and on the passing periods, I noticed that there is like some significant backing up in the hallway. The flow through is not adequate given the growth in the student population there. So I don't know if there's any room in the maintenance budget or the facilities budget to potentially remodel those to have those doors be wider because there is kind of a window opening around them, so they could be wider relatively easily. I don't know if that's been discussed by, with Nate or you or anybody.
We don't have a cost on that yet. We can look at that. I do have some in contingency and capital projects, so we can look at that. One, we just have not had time to get an estimate on what that would look like. But Nate, will you make a note of that so I don't forget?
I got estimates around, I think say it on the revenue, 40 to 50,000, just the one door. But you're gonna have to restructure it, you have to put in all the doors, not just widen them. Probably take out the whole unit, the center, that's really what's causing the problem. That's just what's there.
For one of, because there's two.
Just that one entry that you discussed, just a building coming out into the hallway. So,
Okay.
I mean, that's just that one entry.
Okay.
Both doors wide in that area.
Both doors on the north side?
Just coming out of like.
There's two entry points. Oh, so just one entry would be $50,000? Okay. I'll stop there for now.
Okay, just to go back and address what Brian's comment was about significantly reducing the amount of general fund inter-fund transfer to the debt service, I do not agree with I would not agree to reducing the debt service fund below at least a 3-year debt service window, as mentioned by Scott. Now, that still is a significant reduction if you think about it in terms of what the proposed transfers are, because it's about 1.3 million, I believe, per year. The other way to do it is just to say, look, we want to have a net $4 million transfer in there this year, comprised of the non-general fund contribution, the balance by the general fund. Either of those options, that latter would give you three and a half years of reserve in that fund. It addresses not leaving too much in the general fund for possible lobbying for other uses. It preserves the full faith and credit of this district. It aligns those ESSER funds with their intended use, as Debbie mentioned, and we have the flexibility to go back next year and grab that additional money and earmark it for debt service if the lay of the land allows us to do so. So that's my comment there. Any other comments on that point? I do want to talk about the capital projects fund. I want the budget committee to understand the fundamental difference between a fund like the debt service, where the annual debt service is appropriated, as opposed to the capital projects fund, where the entire fund is appropriated this year and therefore could be spent upon approval and adoption by the board. And my comment there is not that the projects listed are not worthwhile. They've been prioritized, thoroughly vetted. We're in a rising cost environment, which kind of indicates we should be doing these things sooner rather than later. But I do believe that when you fully appropriate a capital projects fund, which is about, what, $3+ million? Sherry, what's the total amount in the capital projects
I
fund?
think it's like 6.78 or 6.8.
Yeah.
But that includes the money,
6.8, yeah.
that includes the money for Lincoln and Redwood if we get those seismic grants.
Okay.
John, another comment
Yeah, go ahead.
on the debt service.
Yeah.
So you do have some flexibility in there in providing relief to the general fund, because if you needed to tap into the $4 million more than, what you're looking at right now, because you're looking at a transfer from a variety of sources, you could eliminate the $350,000 transfer into the general fund completely. And so you would just be tapping into the debt service more and taking more pressure off of the general fund. And so there's a variety of ways you could look at tapping into that money sooner so that you can use money in other areas for different things that could then shore up the general fund. So I don't want you to think that you have no flexibility when you put the $4 million in the debt service fund. There is flexibility there.
All right.
Oh,
You have a comment? Does that mean that if this body were to decide to approve a budget that allows for an aggregate of $4 million in total to go into the debt service fund, that we could leave it to you to make sure it gets in there in the way that maintains the most flexibility going
Yep.
forward?
Yep.
Okay. So back to the capital projects point, it's not that the list of capital projects isn't valued, that the due diligence hasn't been done and the priorities haven't been established. It goes to the point of nimbleness as we go into the new year. So what I'd like to talk about for a minute, Sherry, if you and Kirk could address, or the admin team, how many of these projects are front-loaded into the summer so that money would be spent by the time we got out to the fall and possibly had to use it, look at putting some brakes on?
So we're looking at doing all of the floor refinishing this summer, and so that's coming from ESSER funds. The biggest ticket item is the $125,000 carpeting at the PAC. We don't have to do that right now. And then the other one, that's a bigger ticket item, the $30,000 at Grants Pass High School, which is the door opener things. We have to do that. That's an ADA compliance issue. And so that one we really have to do this summer. And so there's not a lot in there because we didn't put a lot into the capital projects budget to do this year. It's refinishing the gym floors. We've got some fencing around the lunch area at South Middle School. Wouldn't have to do that. That's kind of a safety issue. The new music risers at Allendale, again, that's a safety issue. The risers there are in disrepair and we really need to replace those. I mean, some of these are little, like the curtains at Highland, that's only $2,000. Looking at the upper field at Lincoln, the 17,000, we wouldn't have to do that. That's just putting some drainage up there so that we can actually use that area of Lincoln. The drainage is so bad up there. The kids we can't do anything up there. And so, you know, then we've got carpet in the library at Riverside. We wouldn't have to do the carpet in the library at Riverside.
What is the impact if the administration were to say we're going to do those absolute have-tos this summer, but keep our powder dry going into the fall till ADMW's funding, et cetera, solidifies somewhat? Is that going to preclude, if you decide to go ahead with these projects, say in the fall, from them getting done by the end of this next fiscal year?
No, we could do the carpeting at Riverside could be done probably over Christmas break if we deferred that and didn't look at doing that this summer. The fencing at South, we could probably accomplish that over a Christmas break or a spring break. So, you know, most of them, because there's not very many here, could be accomplished at break periods.
So it'll be a safe statement that even if we do appropriate the full amount of money asked for, and therefore it is eligible to be spent, if administration were to exercise a judicious approach to wait a little bit later in the year, that could be done, and anything that we decided to freeze could fall to the ending fund balance and be available for consideration a year from now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
In terms of the flooring, is carpeting the only choice? I mean, I feel like carpeting has a higher, the cost of maintaining it, the cleaning, the
Right.
vacuuming, the maintenance crews that have to deal with that
We've
versus
looked
a
at
hard
the
surface
we've
that
looked at the
maybe
hard
have an
surface.
upfront, but.
We have looked at that at the PAC, and because of the acoustic issues in there, the carpet is not the optimal choice, or hard surface is not the optimal choice in the PAC, mainly because of the acoustics. So, and that's our big ticket item. In our elementary schools, we've tried to do a hard surface when we've done some tile replacements or carpet replacements. That is not met well. There's weeping and gnashing of teeth when we do something, I'm not kidding either, when we do something other than carpet in the classroom, so. Yeah. But we have done it in some places. We have some classrooms at South that we've done the polished concrete. It's different at the middle school level. It works better at the middle school level. We've talked about that here because at some point we're going to have to do something with the flooring here in the high school. And we've talked about doing the polished concrete here, and so that's definitely an option at the high school. The upstairs area, they're not quite sure what, I'm not sure if it's what type of concrete or how they did that, if it's even possible to do a polished concrete up there. And so then you'd be looking at tile or something like that, which is another option for a hard surface that we could do. A little bit more spendy, probably than polished concrete, but we do look at that and we try to do that wherever we can. It's hard when you're talking about little kids and lots of noise and that kind of thing. It makes it tough.
So we only have really $353,000 in capital projects in this budget because the other $5 million is
Seismic.
seismic.
And I do have about 300 and something in contingency too, so we have a little flexibility there. I didn't want to allocate out all of the money in capital projects just because I knew, for one, getting product is impossible, and I knew we weren't going to be able to accomplish a ton of stuff because we're so late in the year already. So there's a little bit of wiggle room already built in.
So we're really not spending very much on capital projects. We sort of know, I mean, it's a trade-off, but we sort of know that those dollars are worth less a year from now. Depending on which category it is. If it's construction, who knows? Do we want to look at, well, when would we know about the seismic grants?
We should know within the next week or two.
like we could wait and approve this budget in 2 weeks?
For sure.
Or the board could make an adjustment before adoption. Is that right?
Yes,
So
definitely.
you wouldn't have to, the budget committee could approve, subject to review by the board, and if that, something of that significance came through, you guys could make an adjustment.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, the roofs really getting done. If we could do them this summer, is that a
No,
possibility?
no, the roofs are going to be next summer.
Okay.
There is no way we can get those roofs done this summer, just because of the timing. The specs have to be built for one, and then just getting them on the guy's schedule, it would be a summer project, because you can't have the kids there because it's a pretty significant project.
And what about some amount of bathroom renovations? I mean, maybe not all of them, but certainly that could relieve some public pressure related to certain things if we have some bathroom renovations.
Well, I see north and south is 182 and 191, so in relative terms, that's very little money to fix some of those things, and that is something that, at least after our last few years on the board, I would strongly encourage us to move forward with that. I think that is money well spent, and while GPHS is 626,000, and it's a little bit more spendy, I certainly would push for the middle schools, and I would strongly consider doing the high school as well. So,
Just what we have in contingency, we probably could, the north bathrooms in, the north and south bathrooms, we could probably start work on those. They wouldn't be able to start probably until Christmas break, maybe summer, probably summer again for those, so.
23 next year?
Yeah.
I have a question. When we look at the page after the capital projects about possible prioritization of ESSER funds, are those projects, would that come from where I don't remember what it was, 3.5 million of
Yeah.
unallocated ESSER funds that
Yeah.
are currently, okay, that's what I was
Yeah.
wondering about. So essentially, if any of these were to move forward, potentially we would be
Using
allocating some of that remaining ESSER funding that's.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Right.
So just to follow up on the bathroom topic, if we're not going to do all of them, it would make sense to me to maybe look at doing the high school more, just from a need standpoint. And I know that number for the high school is larger, but that's because it also included the PAC bathroom. So we might be able to knock that number down by not doing the PAC and just doing the rest of the high school. That would seem to be the priority area from my perspective.
I think I would want to talk to the administrators about that, because I know we have as many issues at the middle school as we do at the high school. I think sometimes even
So
more.
at our last meeting, I happened to be sitting at the table with the principals for North and High School and South, and I just asked them their thoughts, and the middle school said, this is a huge issue for us, and the high school said, not so much. So I'm still in favor of moving forward, but I would say middle schools really need to be done.
Yeah.
preference issue.
I would agree with
The
you.
bullying in general happens in the bathroom because the teacher can't go in.
And we can get those on the calendar for next summer
North, but I have
and
lots of.
make sure that we're including that as we go forward, with any funding that we're saving this year, because we've got a good chunk in contingency, and then we can allocate that in next year's budget. They probably could start them in June when school's out, so a little bit of the funding would be used this year, and then the rest of it would be budgeted in whatever next year is, 23, 24, 22, 23, I'm lost now.
So we've allocated $1 million for the roofs, but we get $2.5 million
Yes.
for the grant. Is there anything, so we got $1.5 million there that
Yep.
are we able to spend that on any other projects? I mean, can we do the cooling system here at the high school, or, I mean, is it just for the roof, and is it that much more
No, it's for
expensive?
seismic upgrades, and so what they'll do is they will.
Oh, they'll okay, no,
They'll
I
do
understand.
structural,
Sure.
yeah, so they'll come.
They'll do the
in all
roof,
the-
and, right.
Yeah, the steel bracing, the doors, the windows, all of that.
Maybe Brian can get his doors then. Oh, this is it, thinking, sorry.
From an overall budget standpoint, the only reason I wanted to discuss the appropriation level, full appropriation of the capital projects fund was not to suggest we should not move money in there as proposed or fully appropriate. I think both make a lot of sense, particularly given the flexibility we have down the road with regard to this fund. I just wanted to highlight the sensitivity on the timing. I do agree that, as things get more clear, make some of those decisions easier, but that inflationary beast is out there too. I would leave it to the judgment of administration to make a determination as to when to, hit the, drop the hammer on these projects. But I just wanted to get it into the record that we had that discussion. Any other comments on any other aspect of the budget document? Do we want to, yes, please. Yeah.
What do you need from us to move forward with the middle school bathrooms today?
Just to tell me that that's what you want us to do.
So we'll pull this one piece out.
We want you to do that. We absolutely want you to do that.
Okay.
I think we have
I
consensus.
think we have a consensus on that, exactly right, so, very good.
So we will get we've already got the plans from ZCS, and so we'll just let them know that we want that on the schedule for next summer, and then they can start getting the bid documents ready to go, and we can start selecting the contractors for that.
Wait, go ahead, Gary.
Population study in the budget, just want to make sure it's in there, because I think that was a really good idea.
Like I said, we have a little bit of flexibility in the capital projects budget, and I've always kept a little bit in there for board stuff like that you guys want to do. So yeah, we can do that. That shouldn't be that expensive to do, maybe 15, 20 grand.
Can we get it started?
Yep.
Okay.
I just need to find out who's doing it now. I don't know if Portland State is still doing it. If not, there is another company that we worked with on one of the projects. I'm going to look up their name now. But yeah, we'll get that going.
So just to wrap up the discussion on the debt service fund transfer, is there a consensus to leave it as it's proposed, which it would be a 4.7 million, 5 million aggregate from various sources transfer into the debt service, which represents about 4 years of debt service, or to pare back, given the issues we discussed earlier, to say a $4 million net transfer in, which would be over 3 years, and then reserve some of that money back in the general fund for possible flexible use without retaining so much that it becomes an attraction to other needs requests, shall we say. Yes.
My recommendation would be to leave it as is in the budget.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, if I can't get air quality upgrades, then I would go with leaving it as it is.
I mean, the debt service transfer. Tom?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree. Leave as
Okay.
is.
I think the consensus is we leave it as it stands. And so any other comments on the proposed budget? Okay, let me take a look at my agenda here. People are getting antsy, pushing their legs. Something about budget discussions is just.
We know, John, it's your favorite.
We'll have a few comments with regard to the budget before we move on to take a motion on its approval. We covered the request for information by budget committee members by virtue of this meeting. Okay, and comments from patrons we've addressed earlier, and that's been covered. If we pass and approve this budget, we will not need any additional budget committee meetings. And before I make a few closing comments, I would like to take this opportunity because this is Sherry Lee's last budget year. And I've worked with Sherry on the budget except for the last few years, since the late 90s. She's always been a critical part of that process. She was a critical business director during my tenure. I could not have prepared a budget, gotten ready for audit, or any of those things without her. For the district, and I believe this committee, and I know there'll be more fanfare, but at least as far as this committee's involvement, I would like to recognize her above and beyond service to this district for so many years, and I want to thank her for that and wish her all the best.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So just to summarize, and I will be repeating a few things that Kirk outlined in his budget message, which I thought was well drafted. The proposed budget reflects certain objectives to help mitigate the impact of the pandemic-related unprecedented decline in our student numbers over the past few years. It includes implementation of prudent budget reductions, including staff attrition to reduce recurring operating costs of the district in this environment. It uses ESSER funds to cover operational costs to maintain existing programs and meet collective bargaining obligation. Funds over 3 years of debt service funding requirement to preserve the district's strong credit rating and maintain credit access for future capital needs. It provides funding for critical deferred maintenance and capital needs over the next year and preserves 5% of operating expenditure general fund reserve, which the district has successfully maintained in the past to ensure the district is reasonably insulated in difficult fiscal times. Due to the potential for an ongoing state school fund revenue decline from reduced enrollment and the limited amount and duration of remaining federal ESSER funds, this year's proposed budget, more than other years, must be approved with a view to the future. In the absence of significant post-pandemic enrollment increases, compensating state school fund increases, or additional federal support, the district will likely be facing much more exhaustive budget reductions going forward, including possible reduction in days, staffing, supplies and equipment, and even a potential facility closure. Going forward in the 2022-23 fiscal year, district administration should exercise heightened fiscal prudence by monitoring enrollment, state and federal school funding, and other revenue growth opportunities that might arise. This also extends to the expenditure side, which should inform collective bargaining, consideration of potential mid-year budget reductions or freezes, and obviously minimizing the use of contingency should the picture not improve, the fiscal picture should not improve. Notwithstanding the school funding challenges of the 2001, 2003, and 2007, 2009 recessionary downturns, I am not aware of a budget year that requires more attention to multiple year fiscal planning and the need for ongoing revenue expenditure monitoring than the district currently faces. Having said that, I believe the proposed budget does a very good job of striking a balance between the district's current financial needs versus long-term fiscal impact planning, and therefore I support approval of the 2022-23 proposed district budget as proposed, recognizing it is subject to adjustment by the board before final adoption. So those are my comments as a presiding officer, and I'll leave it to somebody to make any formal motion with regard to approval of the proposed budget.
Make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Vicki?
Thank you.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you, Glenn. All right, we have a motion and a second. I'm going to call for the vote. All in favor of approving the proposed 2022-23 budget as presented by district administration, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. Any abstentions? Abstention by member DeLaGrange for, do we have somebody taking notes on that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so abstention by member DeLaGrange. The proposed budget is approved as presented, and thank you, administration, very, very much.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I think that means it's time to adjourn, and that's the sole use of the gavel given to me. So I hereby adjourn this meeting.
Vicky and Quinn.
Good job.